She pretended to be poor to test her friends. She moved out of the mansion, rented a tiny apartment with peeling wallpaper, and told everyone the business had collapsed. The plan was simple on paper: strip away the money, take away the cars and the parties, and watch who stayed when there was nothing left to gain. From the first morning in the new place, the truth of what she'd done hit her like cold water. The apartment was small enough that the whole room smelled like whatever was cooking on the single hot plate, and the bed sagged in the middle like a tired old friend. She had brought only 2 suitcases, one of plain clothes, one of papers, and a couple of expensive things she hid away because she knew her test would be useless if she went truly penniless. She learned quickly how quiet poverty can be. Not the clamor of a life without money, but the way ordinary things become decisions. Do I buy the cheap bread or the better fruit? Do I take a bus that's crowded and slow or walk and save the fare? Those micro-decisions, which most people barely notice, tightened her chest the first week, and then, in a strange way, began to teach her something deeper about wanting. She discovered that hunger is not only a mouth ache, it is a mind ache, a tapping, persistent voice that makes you hope and bargain with the world. She realized that part of her old life's numbness had been in not having to answer those little voices because money did it for her. Now she heard them, and they changed how she thought about people. She had rehearsed how she would break the news. She would call, not text but call, and tell them simply that everything had fallen apart, that she was down on her luck. She thought she had perfected the tone, steady, not looking for sympathy, with a little pride left so people wouldn't mistake humility for weakness. On the first call, desperate and aching in a way that living in a mansion had never allowed her to be, she expected at least some pause. She expected a friend to ask, "Do you need anything? Can I help?" She got instead a stream of practical suggestions like a shopping list and an RSVP to a dinner party. "Oh, I'm so sorry. We've got that gala next week. You should still come. You'll get a pick-me-up." And, "Isn't it the worst timing? I wish I could help, but I'm saving for a ski trip." The polite noise was a kind of betrayal. Easy phrases, quick changes of subject, and a tone that assumed the loss would be only temporary for her and mostly inconvenient for them. That first week alone, invitations dwindled. The people who once asked for her advice about stylists and summer homes suddenly found they had no time for someone who could no longer pay for brunch. There was one, though, who didn't vanish. Her name was Mara. Mara had brushed shoulders with Clara in the same circles for years, but unlike the others, she had never shown an appetite for the trappings. She'd been a steady presence at art openings, a person who arrived in second-hand coats and could talk for hours about a single painting. Mara visited the apartment in the rain the first week, carrying a bag of groceries and a thermos of soup, and sat on the couch with her coat still on, as if she were comfortable with the sagging cushions and the wallpaper that peeled in one corner. She did not ask why Clara had done it, at least not at first. She simply made Clara tea and left her coat over the back of a chair. "You look like you need warmth," she said, and it was not sarcasm. Clara was startled by the simplicity of the action, by how it folded into the moment and made a room that felt raw feel less raw. She had been expecting tests, betrayals, lectures, or pity. She had not been prepared for someone to act like friendship meant being present without calculation. Clara tested people in small, surgical ways at first. She would not mention the date of her father's return from abroad. She'd pretend she could not cover a dinner bill, and she would watch for the flinch of those who counted on free rounds. At a book club meeting held in a cafe, she let it be known she couldn't bring more cash to split the bill evenly, and most left it to others with a polite grimace and an excuse about being late for a manicure. One friend, Janelle, pretended not to notice. She laughed, then said with an airy tone, "Oh, I'll cover you this once, darling. Don't worry." The word darling was a small assault when it came from someone who had borrowed more than she'd returned. Another, Tom, who had been close in high school, began to reply slowly to texts and eventually stopped replying at all. The slow quiet that friendship became when money left was more painful than any public rejection. It was the sense that intimacy had been built on perks and not on personal regard. Each fading conversation was like a small burn on people who had once been central to Clara's life. Meanwhile, Mara settled into the rhythm of the apartment like a neighbor who arrived with a key and a pot of stew. She helped paste a loose strip of wallpaper back into place with paste bought from the corner store. She taught Clara to fold laundry in corners that made the small place look purposeful. She laughed in a way that did not audition for an audience, and she sat with Clara while she closed her eyes and let herself be afraid. When Clara said aloud that she feared people liked her because of the name on her mail and not because of her voice, Mara listened without flinching. She said, "I don't care about your name," in a quiet voice that did not ask for proof. It simply stated a boundary. That small declaration was what allowed Clara to breathe a little. It was not that Mara performed loyalty. She lived it. Her actions were consistent in a way that made them believable. When a pipe burst one icy night, Mara took off her coat and spent the hours with her on the floor, trying to hold a bucket under a drip while the landlord took forever to call back. That was not charity. It was being a steady person in a small life when it mattered. Still, Clara pushed the test to extremes because she needed proof. One summer she claimed she'd lost a job she'd never had, citing a quiet restructuring. She told vivid little lies that fit the ruse and then watched people's reactions. Some friends offered advice on job hunting with a tone of superiority. Some asked if the bank would cover her mortgage just this once, a way to probe whether she might still be the person who could fund their life in return for favors. A few took to pointing out that they had been loyal for a decade and flashed images of past vacations as quiet reminders that loyalty is a currency too. Clara began to see kindness transacted and realized she had been trading status for the same inauthenticity the rest of them would gladly trade. That realization was cruel. It meant she had been part of a machine that encouraged people not to see her, but to orbit the value she represented. What returned started as a small, steady thing. A hand on her shoulder when doors slammed shut, a check-in breakfast that became a ritual. Mara did not stage elaborate acts to prove she was real. Her loyalty was ordinary, buying a roll at the bakery and leaving half for Clara, listening to stories without pressing for the high points, agreeing to meet on a slow Tuesday when everyone else wanted Fridays because the social calendar required grand gestures. Her life was not grand. She did not drive a car that had leather seats. She owned instead an old bicycle and a cardigans collection that smelled faintly of lavender. Clara watched, and what she saw over time was not the kind of loyalty you announce, but the kind that doesn't stop at convenience. Mara's presence was a quiet answer to the slow loneliness that had sapped Clara's courage. Every simple act was a stitch in a new, stronger seam. As the months wore on, the social fallout ripened into a storm. Clara's wealthy friends, those who were used to flatters and favors, began to show up only when they expected a return. One called and wanted to catch up and then asked for a small favor that would have required money Clara no longer admitted to possessing. Another sent invitations that were carefully worded to avoid mentioning that Clara no longer mingled in their circles. "We miss you at the club," the message said. "Drop by when you can." They were all courteous, but courtesy is often a fake coin turned out in bright light. It lacks weight. Clara saw with painful clarity that the smiles she had once worn were often mirrors of convenience, rather than windows into companionship. The revelation did not make her proud. It made her sober. She saw the old self as an actor who had once been paid to play a role in a show of mutual convenience. The life she had left was a play where everyone had been casting for parts, and she had been too glad to fill one. The more she watched, the more she realized how much performance had shaped all their interactions. The lunch paid for, the front row seats, the favors done and expected in reciprocity. Her life had been a marketplace of affection, and it had been disguised as friendship. She had thought the wealth purchased choices. What it purchased, she now saw, had been people's time and the illusion of devotion. Her test in that light was brutal, but it gave her a clarity she had never had. She began to answer invitations differently. To the gala callers she said, "No, I won't be attending." And sometimes she added softly, "I'm trying to simplify things." She learned the rare pleasure of declining with no need to justify. It felt at once scary and freeing. It was not without cost. When the news that she had fallen spread through the grapevine, her family called it an unfortunate rumor. Her father, a man who measured his life by market share and public perception, summoned her to the house to ask if she'd made a mistake. He had never been cruel, not in the way of petty meanness. His cruelty was in the casual way he treated people as units of capital. He had hoped his daughter's social life would be an extension of the brand. When she admitted to him that she had enacted the test, he was stunned, then furious, then strangely silent. For a time their relationship quieted into an understanding that neither would discuss. He would not pry further into her moral experiment, and she would not use his money to buy back the people who had never belonged to her heart anyway. That silence was both cold and, in an odd way, a relief. Not everything wanted reconciliation. Sometimes the brave acts of letting go make their own kind of peace. Clara's inner life changed in ways that were not fashionable or dramatic. She became more methodical about gratitude, more deliberate about what she would accept into her world. She discovered the small pleasures of ordinary days with Mara: roasted potatoes cut thin and crisp, afternoons at the library with no plan but to read, a long walk that turned into a conversation about how both had felt like outsiders at different times. Those small rituals knitted her raw edges into something gentler yet more resilient. But with that growth came hard moments too. There were nights when she would lie awake and ask herself if she had been too cruel to those who had drifted away. Perhaps a few had left because of their own problems, not because of opportunism. She had become judge and executioner of friendships, and sometimes that power frightened her. She wondered whether she had made enemies out of people who might have returned to her in a crisis if she had only let them. The trap of moral testing is that it can create the very loneliness it intends to identify. Sometimes people fail not because they are false, but because life is painful and messy. The turning point came on a raw spring afternoon. There was a leak in the roof after a night of heavy rain, and Clara discovered the landlord's reluctance to act. Water dripped through a ceiling corner and pooled on the floor near the teetering bookshelf. The phone had no signal except for the shaky kind, and the landlord said it would take a week for the repair. The smallness of the apartment felt suddenly dangerous. A slow leak could rot beams and make rooms unsafe. She thought of calling one of the old friends, someone who had always answered her in the past for emergencies, and then she thought of Mara's steady hand and picked up the phone instead. Mara arrived within the hour, an umbrella dripping on the floor, and together they shoved boxes to one side, stacked plastic bowls to catch the water, and spent the afternoon heating tea and talking about neither their triumphs nor their trials. When Mara left, she brushed rain from Clara's hair like she was brushing lint from fabric, and before she closed the door, she said simply, "You're not alone in this. Call me if it gets worse." It was not a grand promise. It was a small, human one, and it felt like shelter. At the same time, some of the people who had abandoned Clara tried to wiggle back into view. They called with saccharine apologies and vague stories of new business ventures that had consumed them. A few, when pressed, made public gestures of amity, likes and comments on social media posts that said, "Glad you're okay," but which in private messages said little. Clara watched these moves with a kind of weary amusement. She was not cruel. She simply declined invitations and started showing up to events only as a spectator who could leave when comfort faded. When Janelle tried to organize a gathering that included Clara and perhaps some others, Clara accepted as an experiment, but left early because the conversation skewed quickly to details of mortgages, homes, and parties. Details that once had been showered upon her and now were gossip among the still insular. The emptiness of the talk felt like proof of how little had changed. They had not come back to her as a person but as a scandal to gossip about. The most dangerous moment arrived when a rumor started that Clara's father was considering cutting ties publicly to manage brand risk. It was a wild, malicious whisper that made the rounds at events and in executive circles, and the implication was clear. If you were seen with the wrong person, your standing might erode. The idea infuriated Clara. Here was the arcane truth she had waded into all along. The life she had come from was organized around reputation and fear of guilt by association. She had tested for that. She had answered her own question by burning a bridge and seeing who swam to shore. The painful vindication did not make her proud. It made her resolute. She doubled down on living honestly. She began to open up about her idea, not as a triumphant reveal, but as a conversation. In small groups and then in larger ones, She told the story of how she wanted to know who would stand by her if she had nothing to offer. Her delivery was not meant to shame others, but to lay bare what human loyalty looks like when stripped of markets and perks. When people finally heard the full story, reactions were messy and varied. Some apologized and meant it with a sincerity that surprised them. Others remained cool and distant, as if the test had been indecent and unfair. There were those who accused her of playing games with people's goodwill, as if testing friendship was a cruelty, no different from seduction. These arguments stung but also offered polish to her own thinking. She realized that a test of friendship had ethical terrain. By manipulating hope and trust, she had trafficked in the same currency she criticized. The conversation forced her to hold both meanings. She had learned a truth about people's behavior in certain social economies, and she had also wounded some who might have been struggling with their own limitations. The clarity she gained did not absolve her from regret. In the end, it was not the social media posts, the invitations, or the gossip that mattered. It was the quiet life that formed around Clara and Mara. Clara invited Mara to the mansion one day, without pomp, and Mara came as she was with thrift store earrings and a bag of pastries. They sat in a living room filled with art that had once been the currency of Clara's life and now felt like a museum of memories. Clara opened the heavy curtains and watched sunlight wash across a carpet she once thought necessary to measure happiness. Mara looked around and said, "It's a lot of space for one person." Clara laughed with an honesty that had been forged in months of scarce soup and sleeping with windows cracked. "It was never the space," she said. "It was the people I thought filled it." Mara reached across the coffee table and took Clara's hand. "Then fill it with the people who stay," she said. It was not a clever line. It was a simple rule for a life Clara was finally ready to build. A few surprising developments followed that were not dramatic, but meaningful. Some of Clara's former friends tried to rebuild relationships with sincerity rather than convenience. A couple had legitimate hardships that had made them appear selfish. They apologized and Clara forgave them. The act of forgiveness felt like an unshackling. She had expected vindication to taste sweet, but it tasted watered. The sweeter thing was to choose who she would want near her, those who pleased themselves by loyalty and those who practiced it quietly. She also saw that Mara's steady kindness was contagious. Mara helped Clara set up a small scholarship for art students in their neighborhood, and the project drew people to them who did not come for dinners or glitzy openings, but for the work of helping children hold on to dreams. Clara's father watched this transformation with that same dispassionate evaluation he used on quarterly results. But something softened. He came to a small dinner, not the gala, just a table of close family and a few friends that included Mara, and sat across from his daughter. He did not make speeches about branding or loyalty. He ate and listened. There is a point where the calculation of consequences becomes less important than the evidence of being loved back. A kind of reconciliation grew out of the quiet, not forgiveness from him for whatever she had done, but a new kind of respect for a woman who had learned the price of solitude and the value of having chosen connection over appearances. Life moved on. Clara did not go back to pretending to be poor. The experiment had been cruel and necessary and done. She kept the apartment for months as a reminder of how it felt to wrestle with scarcity, and she made sure her decisions were governed by gratitude rather than fear. She learned to set boundaries to avoid being used again, but she also learned to accept the cost of being open. The friends who remained, including those who returned with genuine apologies, sat at small tables and talked about books and summer plans in a new way. The people who had never returned were not punished. They were merely not invited. Clara felt a curious freedom in letting people live with the consequences of their choices. She had no desire for revenge. The revelation of truth was enough. The last scene in this long season of change is not a dramatic courtship or a grand reconciliation, but a small Saturday afternoon. The house is quiet. Light spills through the windows and dust motes float like tiny planets. Mara sits at the kitchen table rolling out pie crust with a concentration that makes her brow furrow. Clara chops apples and sprinkles sugar, thinking of the months of searching and the quiet rituals that had built a life she had never expected to want. Emily, The neighbor down the stairwell who had once taught Clara how to thread a needle pops by with her toddler, who insists on bringing a small, lopsided drawing for Clara. They laugh at the crooked lines and pin the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet. The house feels full in a way that never has to prove itself. It is not the same fullness of a gala or a party. It is a fullness made by consistent small acts, by the accumulation of time spent with people who choose you whether or not they stand to profit. She keeps a list now, not of the people who stayed and who left like before, but of small true things. Mara's hands in dough, Emily's lullaby off-key and strong, the landlord finally replacing the broken window because the new neighborhood association had pressured him. When she looks back, Clara understands that her test would never have given her a tidy answer. People are complicated, and loyalty is not a single act, but a pattern over time. Some had failed her because they were selfish. Others had failed because life's logistics do not always allow for heroism. But one truth remained unambiguous. The person who showed up when the roof leaked and sat on the floor with a bucket was the person who mattered most. The wealth she came from could produce comforts and opportunities, but it could never manufacture the steady, ordinary devotion that kept a life warm. In the end, Clara stopped trying to prove people to herself in clever traps. She used what she had learned not to catch people, but to ask better questions. Who listens when I speak? Who shows up without a ledger? Who stays when silence is the only reward? Those were the friends she kept. The rest she allowed to drift, not with bitterness but with a calm acceptance that some people simply choose differently. Her world narrowed in some ways and widened in others, and she lived with that choice every day. She never regretted the pain she had caused, because it had revealed the people who mattered. She held the friend who stayed, the one who had quietly shared soup in a sagging apartment, the one who had kept a hand on her shoulder without pretense, with a gratitude that had no price tag. In the quiet that followed, she finally felt rich in the only currency that ever mattered: fidelity, kindness, and the small acts that make a house a home.